Hello there, Maxon. So today we're going to continue with Dustin on the DPP render and demystifying post-production. So let me show my screen. I'm going to present. Here we are. So yes, today is the second week of demystifying post-production, make your 3D render pop with Dustin. So we're going to continue where we left last week about AOV and so on. And right now Dustin is going to composite everything in Photoshop and make it look great. So if you want to see the last show, you just go to the Maxon training team. We're going to post the links in the chat very soon, where you have all the Maxon training team, all the clips, the C4D quick tip, the Redshift quick tip. If you go here to the stream, you can see all our shows. So this is the last one. No, actually, this is the one which is planned. We are right now here and we have this one. So this one is the one we did last week. And Dustin is going to talk to us about his YouTube channel, CGHacks, where he has all kind of tips, interesting video and so on, covering Redshift and compositing. And also is going to share with us a discount code that we're going to post in the comments too, where you can have his products with overlays that is going to use during the show. So I think I didn't forget anything, Dustin. So how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Welcome everybody. Yeah, it's exciting. Week 2.
So I guess we're going to show your screen now, and I'm going to paste all the code and so on very soon.
Cool. So last week, talking about a discount code, that's just something that's there if you guys would like to check it out. Lionel will get those posted. But we talked about the Smartify plugin last week. There are 2 freebies on CGHacks. So the Smartify plugin and the mini pack of overlays that are going to be a good starter for you to use and get into doing some of the different effects and stuff that we'll be doing today. So in traditional fashion, I forgot to include an actual 16-bit PSD in the downloads. So I have the multipass EXR that we're going to be using in week 4. And it's actually a really good opportunity to talk to you about kind of how I go about changing bit depths when I'm working inside of Photoshop. So with that being said, we can go ahead and get started with this. Now, we'll see here we have the Raptor comp. We have our RGBA up top. This is going to be the beauty that we're going to be using to composite today. And then we have a whole list of other render layers here that we aren't going to use and some that we are going to use. So last week I talked about kind of a hybrid approach to the multi-pass rendering, which is really just using a beauty pass and then things like these specular reflections, maybe some lighting passes that are off on their own or direct output, things like that. And so this is going to be a really good chance for us to dive into some of these layers, take a look at what they are, and then kind of use all of those to copy and move over to a 16-bit version of this file. So we did quite a bit of discussion last week in Redshift and the AOV manager and what some of those passes look like, how to set those up. And so we're not really going to cover as much of that today. We'll just look at the passes here in Photoshop as we move on. So we have our RGBA. This is going to be our beauty, our ambient occlusion. We talked about that for some really nice contact shadows and details. We have a blank background pass. So this is something we can just easily delete. And as we're going through this, again, this is in the download files. It's the Raptor multipass .exr that we're using right now if you want to go ahead and kind of follow along with this. So our beauty pass, let's go ahead and delete that. We don't need that for this one. Now we have the bump normals here, which is something that we're definitely going to be using. This is what we'll be using to relight and add some cool lighting details based on channels. We'll get to that stuff a bit later. We have our crypto mats, the object, and then the material IDs, or the material IDs and then our object, reading those backwards. We have our depth. So once we get to a depth pass, most of the time I'm going to be using this as an alpha channel. Next week, maybe this week towards the end, if we have time, we'll talk about how to create a depth of field. That's all on the docket for next week. But this is something that I know for sure right away that I want to have in my channels panel here off to the left. And so what we're going to do is select the blue channel, just control or command, click on the blue thumbnail, and we can save this selection as an alpha, and then we'll rename this to Z depth. There we go. So we know we have that. And then moving on, we have just our normal kind of what I would consider beauty passes. And we have our direct lighting or our diffuse lighting, our emission, our fire lighting here that you'll see. We could talk about this a little bit. I was setting up light groups in Redshift and had it kind of duplicated. So when you open the file, this is one of those kind of gotchas, if you will, but it was more my mistake. But it's definitely good for you to know that sometimes if you kind of set up dual light groups, you're going to get two different passes. One's going to be blank, the other one's going to have the information. And so this was more me kind of a glitch, I guess, a mental glitch as I was starting to go and set these up. So we have our fire lighting, blank pass, delete it. We have our actual fire lighting pass that we can delete out for this one. Again, we'll save this as its own file so that you're not really losing the original EXR. We're not going to be using this today because we'll talk about normal passes to adjust some of those different effects here. Global illumination, we'll get rid of it. Key light, get rid of it. Now, our actual key light pass that has the information, this is one that most of the time I'm going to save because this is going to be a bit different than using a normals pass to create rim lighting and so on. For today's stream, we'll delete that out of here. Now, we have some of our puzzle mats that I have set up for this that just make selections quite a bit easier. And so with these three, I'm definitely going to keep those. We can hide those, excuse me, hide those for a moment. And then we get down to our reflections, our refractions, our rim lighting. Again, this is another one of the blank passes. We can delete that. And then we have our blue rim lighting that's here in the scene. So most often I'm going to be using this normals pass and the relighting method that we'll be talking about to create and accentuate rim lights. So in our case here, this is something that will be great for week 4. Today, we're going to delete it. We have our subsurface scattering. We'll get rid of that. In our shadows, we can get rid of that as well. And so all we're doing right now is just organizing for this specific stream. Now, as we start to do this, you'll be wondering why I'm deleting a bunch of these passes and going through this whole process. There's two reasons for that. The first one is that we are actually setting up a bit more of that hybrid kind of beauty, type of setup that is meant for this week. The other side is that we're able to look at all of the passes that we had, and then we can delete a lot of that information and work with just a few render passes. This is something that took me a while in the industry to get used to. As a composite artist, I like to have all the information. And a lot of times when you have more control, you spend more time, you tend to get more nitpicky and perfectionist about things. And ultimately, it can slow and kind of crumble like progressive workflows. So right now, we're going to keep the specular pass. We'll delete the translucency lighting and maybe reflections and refractions. We can get rid of those as well. Emission, diffuse lighting, we'll get rid of those. And now we're left with our specular lighting pass, which is going to give us really nice reflections. And we have our puzzle mats. So like I talked about last week, I like to organize these files a certain way. And so I'm going to select with Shift, not my caps lock. I'm going to select all of my info passes, and we're going to group those and call this ACC. These are all of my accessory passes. Same thing as info passes. I don't know why, but accessory makes more sense to me. So with these being done, we have the accessory pass. In fact, we can throw the specular lighting in there because that's something that's going to be additive on top of everything later on. And here we have it. We have a whole list of passes that we can use now. So at this point, we have a 32-bit file, and we want to go and crunch all of that down to a 16-bit file. So as we're starting to do this, there's actually two things that I would consider is merging the entire layer stack, which is the best to preserve details, right? And then just copying the layers that I need and pasting those back in. So this is something that I found to be quite a bit easier for me to do. The other option is, especially if I'm dealing with specifically say like the info channels and I'm only using a beauty pass, and then I have my puzzle mats, crypto mats, normals pass, I could set up the alphas all in advance, because once I go and merge everything back in, it's still going to maintain all of those alpha channels. I'm not going to worry about that today. Just know that that's something that I'm going, to consider as we start to move on. Maybe in week 4, we'll get to that a little bit more, especially as we start to build our beauty composite or rebuild that using all of the layers. And then we merge that down to actually take advantage of a 16-bit workflow. It's all things to consider. So here we have our accessory passes. I'm going to Control C, copy this entire group, and then we can hide this group here. Now we have our RGBA, or our standard beauty pass. I'm going to head up to image, mode, and then we'll see that we have our 8, 16, and 32-bit here. Click on 16-bit. This is going to be asking me if I want to merge everything. In this case, it's fine. We'll go ahead and click merge. And then we have the HDR toning. This is something I get a lot of questions about for people that have seen me go through this process, and they kind of forget the one step here, because this changes the way that your entire composite will look. So currently we're sitting at our default preset. This is the method of local adaptation. We do not want that, because we have to actually think about, the way that gamma works and all of these other things. We could get into the science. We don't really need to do that in this case. All we have to do, change that to exposure and gamma, and then we'll see everything flip back to normal. Don't mess with the sliders at all, and we can click OK. And now we have our beauty pass, or layer 1, set up here. So at this point, we've already copied our layer group. We can paste that back in. And so now we have a 16-bit file with the groups that we had from our 32-bit set. And they're all going to maintain all of the color information the way that we were used to seeing them. So at this point now, we've converted from 32 to 16. We've cleaned up our comp, and we're ready to work with it. If you're working in a 32-bit workflow, like I said, and we'll find this out in week 4 when we're actually working 32-bit for most of the time before we get to finishing, you're going to have a lot of tools that you can't actually use. So we talked about it some last week. And at this point now, when we're in 16-bit, we can take full advantage of everything that Photoshop has to offer, kind of minus certain filters and things like that. But I don't use those too often when I'm doing 3D composites. So I like to work non-destructively. I like to use smart objects. This is really more from my experience in the industry, right? If we have to go back to a client file, make changes, you don't want to just paint on top of layers and merge everything down all the time. That's kind of a personal work type thing, but I'm also an information hoarder when it comes to my own work. And I like to work with smart objects and just deal with extremely large files. So right now, what we're going to do is select all of our layers, and we're going to create smart objects of all of these and just work that way. So traditionally, we would have to right click one of these. If we just go to each file, right click, convert to smart object. This is where that freebie download from CGHacks comes in. It's the plugin called Smartify Layers. What we can do here is select all of our layers, open up Smartify Layers once it's installed, and then we can click on these selected layers to smart objects. And this is going to make that process a lot easier for us and just individually create smart objects based off of our selection. There we go. All right. Do we have any questions at this point? Is there anything? Maybe crickets? Anybody? Okay, so we'll assume that there's no questions. Now, at this point, what we're going to do is start to build out some of these different alpha channels that we know we're going to want to use. We talked about it last week. This time we're going to be using the puzzle mat, and this just makes it easier because we can select 100% alphas here. I'm primarily focused on the Raptor. So what we'll do is we'll select the green channel in our channels panel, create a new alpha. We'll call this Raptor Skin. And we'll do the red. This is going to be the teeth. And we can take a look at our other puzzle mats. So this one here is actually pretty interesting because this is really just all of the foreground rocks that are going around the outside. I would say that we could probably just select all three of these together and just call this foreground rocks. And then we have our background buildings. And for this, we'll select the green channel, call this buildings, and then the red channel, and we can call this windows. And so now, because we already have our Z depth pass here, we have a pretty good setup for that. So if you don't use Photoshop too often, I'm just using Controller Command D to deselect so we don't have any of our little marching ants around everything. And yeah, there we have it. We have a pretty solid base to go ahead and get this started. Can turn all of these off. I think what we'll do is take our specular lighting and we can pull that down out of our accessory group now. And we'll do the same thing for AO. And let's take a look at the bump normals. So what we're going to talk about right now or more immediately is how to use the normals pass to start relighting or accentuating light that's in our scene. A really good way to do this and practice with this is just take an object and render it out with very ambient lighting out of Redshift and just have a normals pass and start to work with that quite a bit and use the techniques that we're going to be talking about today. So inside of our bump normals, let me hide my AO pass here a moment. Inside of the bump normals, we have the red, green, and blue channels. So last week we talked a little bit about the green channel, which is what I use most of the time. And this is going to allow us to get really nice light and shadows. So we can use this as it sits. Just select the green channel, place in a curves layer, and start to build that up. And then we can also use what I call hue shifting normals to start to adjust the way that that light is wrapping and create like some really cool lighting effects with that as well. So let's start with the green channel. And what we'll do is actually select it and we can create a, we'll say Y plus. So this is going to be our up normals. And we can go back to green. Let's see what this looks like inverted. Select it, create a new mask or a new alpha, and we can do Y minus. There we go. Control D to deselect, and then Command I to invert that. So now thinking of the way that a layer mask is going to work, where white pixel values are going to allow you to affect parts of the image and the black parts are not going to be affected. This is going to allow us to get some really cool lighting effects from underneath our subject here. And we can hide our bump normals for now and take a look at our layer one. So let's name this beauty. Install today. There we go. Now we're going to controller command, select our Y normals, and we can head straight into our adjustment layers. It's a little circle kind of split in half here at the bottom, and we'll use a curves adjustment layer. We can organize that just a little bit. And now we can actually adjust the brighter values. So this may be a little bit difficult to see because we're seeing our transparency grid here. So I can go in and select a solid color. We'll just do something a bit darker and place that as our background. And now selecting our curves, we can see the adjustments here. So using the Alt key or the Option key, we can click our layer mask thumbnail, and this is going to bring up the mask that we have. So there's a couple things to take into consideration when we're dealing with masks like this, and this is whether we're going to make adjustments to the layer mask specifically, or we want to go in and adjust the actual channel or the Y plus channel in this instance, and like where we want to make that break. I personally like to leave a default version of the layer mask or the alpha inside of my channels panel because that's my library. And then I'll just manipulate the layer mask as I need per different layer that I'm using. And if I need to reuse that multiple times, usually more than 2 or 3 times, I'll just create an alpha based off of that layer mask selection. So it gets a little bit different. Okay, so do we have any questions yet? I know that we're moving a bit fast.
So yes, last time there was just a question from me, but I forgot to include myself in the stream, so you didn't hear me. My fault. You had just a comment from Ricky Sharp asking about the 32-bit versus 16-bit. 16-bit is faster to work with. You said that already. Just wanted to confirm.
Yeah, 32-bit is quite a bit much. It leads to a much larger file. You have a lot more control over the brights and the darks of your image. And from my experience as somebody who worked with 32-bit for a very long time, it's not always needed. It's really not. Like I said, when we'll just take personal projects. If I'm building portfolio pieces, I don't work with 16 or work with 32-bit anymore. 16 is the highest I'll go. Sometimes I'll work with 8-bit. It all really just depends on kind of how happy you are with the results.
Yes.
In your image. So something we didn't talk about as much, we can kind of pause here for a moment. Something that we didn't talk about as much last week is the whole theory of getting it right in camera. So as a photographer, we hear it all the time. It's all just get it right in camera and, learn exposure and do these different things and all this stuff, right? And at the end of the day, it's all stuff, but it's really good stuff. So having the proper exposure, or as close to within whatever time frame you have from 3D moving into post-production is going to be very beneficial. Like you don't want to render out with, say from Redshift with blown out highlights, especially if you're at anything less than, 32-bit. But you don't want to render out, images with a loss of detail, whether that's in the blown out highlights or the darkest point in your shadows. And so, especially when you're dealing with ACES, ACES has, quite a different, curve than working with sRGB. And so you get some really nice like roll offs to your highlights and some really nice like kind of depth to your shadows. Sometimes that can be too much because if you're working fast, you might say, hey, I can just boost this in post. You bring it in and then you throw your ACES transforms on it and everything gets too dark and you have a hard time working with it, especially because Photoshop doesn't natively work with the OCIO. It can be tough to deal with. So getting your exposures right, in camera, excuse me, in Redshift, is definitely going to help you anywhere. For me, when I'm shooting photography, I like to make sure that my images are dramatic. My lighting is coming from a nice direction. I don't get super nitpicky and technical about exposure and everything like that because I am a post-production artist. I enjoy doing post. I just make sure that I'm not losing detail. That's the biggest thing that you can make sure. So any other questions?
I totally agree with that. That's what I tell my students very often. Get it right the first time, because if your lighting is wrong, you won't be able to do much in post-production. It will feel off. It will feel fake. If it's right already inside Redshift, on your camera, also in the real world, it will be much easier. Maybe you won't have anything to do in post-production.
Yeah. And I do feel, I will say though, that I do feel that learning post-production and knowing post-production is vital. Whether you're a photographer or a 3D artist, I feel like understanding the tools that you have at your disposal is more important than not knowing them, right? And that is kind of why you're all here this month. It's a little bit different, we all come, to watch these streams and learn new things. But it is very important to start learning, how to do post-production, for two reasons. Like a great photo is a great photo is a great photo. Post-production isn't always going to, make it extravagant. You can change certain things, hue saturation, add some nice clarity pops, different things of that nature. But at the same time, like there are some really cool effects, cool things that you can do in post. On the 3D side, post is where we make things generally look more truly realistic, right? You can add imperfections. I have like a rule of quarters, like 4 steps of imperfections when I'm in 3D. That's lighting, materials, could be chromatic aberration using like bokeh textures, like different things. Like as long as you start to break things up, it's not going to be so perfect. But once you get to the post-production side, that's where you can really fine tune some of those details. And have a bit more control over your renders to truly make them pop. So I think it's a good thing to learn. Fix it in pre instead of fixed it in post. Yeah, I like the idea of fixing it for sure in pre. Measure twice, cut once, and then enhance it in post. I used to be a bit tough on myself about it and like I just learn Photoshop and I'll get it right and I'll do all of this thing. It's not. Don't make your life harder. Learn photography. If you're a 3D artist, learn the fundamentals of photography, especially with Redshifts, camera updates. I love them, but you can actually like think as a photographer, and ultimately like the photography fundamentals are going to carry you a lot farther than any Photoshop stuff that at least if you're going for realism, cinematic looks, things like that. Fix it in pre, enhance it in post, and move forward. Anyways, okay. So we have our curves here, and this curves layer is going to be adjusting the top side of our model. How do we adjust our layer mask now that we have this here? Well, we can do like we did previously, and we can Alt or Option click on our layer mask thumbnail, And at this point, we can use levels and we can use curves to brighten and darken this image. So all of the gray tones, we'll say if they're 50% gray, it's going to have a 50% of that curves on our actual model. Maybe we want that to be a bit more. So what we'll do is we can use levels, bring up our levels here, Controller Command L, and this is going to allow us now to start to crunch these values in from that normal pass. And this is one way to easily fine tune this look. And this is where I was talking about, having a good base like default channel, having that channel, that alpha that we can go back to, because this is going to be getting a bit destructive as we start to adjust and manipulate all of these different layer masks. So with that being said, we can crush the darks here. We can bring in some of those more white values and we'll click OK. Now clicking back onto our RGB thumbnail here, we can see the adjustments that we have. Like immediately we're able to place quite a bit of emphasis like right on the topmost, facing angles, the most top normals of every model in our scene. So if we don't want that specifically to hit everything, this is where the rest of our channels come into play. So what I like to do is take a look at the Z depth here. We can also start to look at, say, just the raptor. If we just wanted our raptor subject to have that nice outline, we could work with it there. So on, we could do the foreground rocks and all of those. What I'll do is select our Z depth, head back into Alter Option, clicking on our layer mask. And what I want to do now is with the black as our background color here, we can press delete. And we'll see that this gets a little bit darker. We'll see that we just made everything just a little bit darker towards the back. The depth pass has a front to back gradient. So it can be a little bit more difficult to see some of those adjustments because we're still working with the gradient essentially on top of, gradient and grayscale values with the normal pass. So what we'll do here is use another levels adjustment. Using the depth pass as a selection, now we can take everything in the background, and we can sort of see this here as we move in. We can take everything in the background and drop that down a bit further in value, and we'll click OK. Deselect. Now, some of those effects are starting to fade off towards the further back buildings, and we could definitely crush this down even further. I don't think that we need to worry about it too much at this point. Now, with the reverse or the Y minus channel that we have created here, we can select that. Maybe name this one here. We'll just do Y plus, and we'll create another curves layer. Call this Y minus. There we go. And now we'll take a look. Well, let's just make the adjustment. So we're going to bring this a bit darker. And we'll see immediately that it clearly gets quite a bit too dark all over the place. And so in this case, when we're flipping the normals that way, what I'm going to do here is Alter Option, click into Edit the Layer Mask. And now we'll use levels again. Now just bring some of these other values darker, and we'll see that it does get quite a bit crunchy here. This is one area where 32-bit mode works great because you have all of that extra information. But right now, we'll go ahead and select OK. And now we'll use this just to slightly drop some of the midtones that we have. So if we can see it moving in, we're able to make some of those adjustments and drop that down nicely. I can go a little bit further with that and turn it back on. That might help see what we're doing here. Here we go. So we still have a nice and dramatic look on our Raptor. The issue that we're having at this point is that we have other blown out areas. So this area here in the foreground rocks is going to be quite a ways blown out. So what I'm going to do is use a channel. So the foreground rocks, we can control click or command click the thumbnail here. And this is going to allow us to maybe remove some of the effects that we have from that normals pass or the Y plus adjustment that we made. So we can select our layer mask for the Y plus layer with black as our background color here on the left. We can click delete. And now we can see the adjustment that's made. And so now we have our subject that's sticking out quite a bit, has really nice separation, and we have a nice normals adjustment here towards the back of our subject. We can actually tone that down a ways as well so it doesn't get so bright here. Okay, so at this point now, we've talked about the channels and how we can use channels to really just pull direct information from our normals pass. So relighting with normals, this is kind of what it's about. There are other ways to go about this process. I like to use channels the most because it's visual. It's something that I can set up. I don't have to always use blend if and start to change different things in my scene. You know, production wise, this is just very easy for somebody else to open up the file, or even myself a ways down the road. Say I'm doing updates for a client project and I just need to have everything there in the open and see what's happening. I'll know exactly what's going on there. So we have our normals pass. We've already talked about how to pull the channels. Now, if we want to actually hue shift or start to rotate any of these values, it's quite easy to do in Photoshop. So what we'll do here is create a group and just call this normals, have our bump normals inside, and then we can create a hue saturation adjustment layer. And now if we're wanting to use, say, rim lights, we're going to want to choose something like the red. Let's go back up here. There we go. We can use the red, green, or the blue channel. Most of the time I'm using something like red. It will be right on the edges of my subject. But what we have the ability to do is use this hue saturation to truly adjust the hue. And so we'll see here that now we're able to really push and pull these values kind of all the way around our subject. Now, we do want to make sure that we're choosing the, I'll say the direction or the channel that makes the most sense for your desired end result. So for me, I know that red is definitely going to work as I start to get towards rim lights. If I were to use something like the blue channel, we can still get pretty good effects, right? I have found it in, you know, various scene files or various, you know, types of composites that I'll be building, that it doesn't always make sense to completely change the scale of, you know, colors and information that's there. So if you ever run into that, where I say that, but it's almost more like an issue that you'll know when you have it because you start to get like really crunchy edges on some of your channels. Usually what that means is that you're just kind of pushing it too far. So we don't have that here. It's kind of something difficult to replicate, but you'll definitely know when you have that. And so what I would do is reset your hue saturation layer and then kind of select maybe a better channel based on what you actually want as your output. So in this case, let's take a look at green. I double click my hue here, and that's just going to reset it. And this actually gives us some nice results here as well. We can zoom in a little bit because hopefully you'll be able to pick up on some of these areas of weird banding. Lionel, can you see that on this side?
Yeah, we can see it very clearly.
So this is, yeah. So this is one thing that you can run into. So if you see that, it's definitely something where, you know, I would start to adjust the different values here and play with these. Now, again, this is also 16-bit and 32-bit. You're going to have a little bit more control over those values. So yeah, it's definitely a good route to take for this. So let's take a look at resetting. We'll grab something a little bit more useful maybe. I'm just pushing this a little bit further off to the left by going negative. Now, the saturation is actually going to be a little bit different. We can see here where we're able to really start to crunch in some of these details. And so this can make it quite a bit brighter for us, or just adjust that layer mask and remove some of the gray tones. Now, when you're working 16-bit, a little bit different than 32. I feel like I'm going to keep saying that because there are pros and cons to working with a lot of that information. But, as we start to get with some of the banding, we can clearly see some of the differences here. And I don't always pay a ton of attention to that because you can use the lightness slider to start to even some of that out. So it's just finding a nice balance. So as we find that here, we've made our adjustment. Maybe we want to make our red channel now its own alpha. We can create our alpha and then just rename this. This will be rim. Just do rim L for left. You can deselect. Head back up to our red channel here. Start to adjust this a bit further to the other side. I'm going to reset my entire set of adjustment layers here. And now I'm just looking to see how far I can or I want to push this a bit more on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side of our image. And I really don't know if we're even going to need that. So what we'll do is take a look at the RGB because this is where things kind of get a bit wild. Let's go back to normal. So we can see that we have our RGB kind of looks a little bit normal there. Hue shifting, if you're doing this without channels, you can definitely use it to visualize. Like in this case, if I'm looking to get a bit more of a rim light here from the right side, that's definitely going to help us push it. I think that we can pull our specular layer in a bit later to help with some of that. But kind of shows you the way that this looks, rotating all of your colors with hue shift. We can definitely take a look at the differences between the value blending, I'll call it, that we have here versus the 32-bit in week 4. That's going to be quite a bit different. So we'll select our rim light on the left side, and we can create another curves adjustment layer. And we can call this rim L. Now, as we're starting to work with, curves, like I can very easily go in and start to manipulate this and adjust the curves. But if we use the Alt key and we press 2, 3, or 4, we'll see that we're able to manipulate kind of on a per channel basis. So this comes in like really in handy if you like to use something like curves to make color adjustments. Myself, for example, I like to go in, say I'm doing something a bit more of a fiery color. I can add a bit more yellow by going negative in the blues, a little bit more red by negative in the greens, and then maybe just straight up a little bit more red here. And then we can turn that off and on, and we can see the differences in color that we're getting. And it's a very easy way to start to manipulate. You can use this in, say, something like a color balance where you can adjust sliders. I personally like curves. It just happens to be what I use the most. All right. Questions?
Yes, there is a question from Ricky. Instead of removing all the extra lighting on the foreground elements, could you just have created a group and then set up a mask on that group itself and then set the opacity?
Definitely. It really just depends on kind of like what you're wanting to work with overall. That's definitely a good way to do it. I use groups all the time with just one mask. Um, I also use like knockout layers or knockout groups. That's a bit more in depth, kind of more design savvy, straight inside of Photoshop. But I would generally what I'll do is I'll use a group with one layer mask as I'm starting to place different effects in. We'll see some of those as we start to put overlays in, but there's quite a bit that you can do um, just with groups and in a single mask. It's kind of like what's the easiest way to maybe think of some of that? It's kind of like if we're using like a color layer, for instance, in Redshift, and we're starting to stack a bunch of things up on top of one another and creating different masks. Um, Sometimes I like to have like one dominant mask and other submasks that I'll use. And so in this case here, I feel like it's really personal preference as to whether you want to use a whole group and just like opacity or individual masks and stuff like that. It's kind of a workflow thing. So at the end of the day, as long as you organize it all at the end of the day and you know what you did, I think it makes sense.
I also have a question, personal question.
Sure.
You mentioned last week that you learned to do compositing on Nuke. How much techniques did you borrow from Nuke? Because it's quite a different workflow between Photoshop and Nuke.
Oh man. So I used Photoshop before I used Nuke,
All right.
then went to Nuke
Mm.
and had accelerated learning, I would like to think, because I had previously used Photoshop, so I understood, how to layer certain things. I fell in love with nodes when I was using Nuke because it opens everything up, right? Like you can see all of this just laid out. Um, but there are a few things that when I came back to Photoshop, like hue shifting, for example,
Mm.
in Nuke, I just used the hue shift node. Alex Costa, if you see this, thanks. He was one of my soups in the studio, and I was like, dude, you just use a hue shift node and like change the way that all of these normal colors are facing. And that was something I immediately took back to Photoshop when I was doing post. So there are quite a few things. The idea of using, once we get to like the Z depth pass, where are we at with time? Holy cow. See, I do this every week, guys. We'll be going over again. It's okay.
Yeah, don't worry about that.
And so, with Z depth, that was something that, I kind of pulled, from my experience in Nuke because Photoshop at the time didn't have very good support, or even neural filters. So now they have like a depth mask neural filter inside
Mm.
of Photoshop that works okay. You can get okay results with it. Definitely not near as good as a truly rendered 3D depth pass, but color grading using like the depth passes and things like that is all stuff that I kind of carried over from Nuke. So it's from one thing to another. It's kind of like I learned Photoshop, then I got into 3D, then I got into photography, and I use a lot of my photography in 3D and a lot of my 3D kind of knowledge in photography. It's actually allowed me to
Yes.
be a bit more creative on the photography side, because now I don't worry so much about the technical and I focus a little bit more on the creative aspects. It's good.
It's a really key point to be able to borrow knowledge from one field to the other. Myself, I come from cinema, from the movies when I was quite younger, and I still use a lot of the techniques I learned over there, especially for camera, for placing camera, for example. So
Yeah,
when you learn something somewhere, you can use it elsewhere, and then you go back to the first thing, and then you can reapply the knowledge you gain, and so on and so on.
definitely. Okay, I'm looking at our list here for today. I'm like, how are we going to fit all of this in? See, we do this. People, I like to talk, especially once I get into talking about all of these different things. So let's start off. We talked about normals. We talked about hue shifting, talked about channels, how to manipulate those and go back and forth. Um, let's do a little bit, just kind of showing the AO here and what we can do with this. So with our AO pass, this is going to be set to a multiply blend mode because we're going to want to enhance some of the darker points or more of those ambient shadows. Now, because this is a smart object, any adjustment that we make to this is going to be a smart filter, which means we can modify that later. This is why I like to work in a non-destructive way. So with the AO, we can use really anything. I think I'm going to use curves here instead of levels. And we can start to make this a bit brighter in the highlights. Let's go ahead and cancel that a second. And I'm going to set that back to normal, and then we'll make these adjustments. It just helps visually see a bit better here what we're doing. So I'm going to make these a bit brighter using levels now instead of curves. See, I go back and forth. That's okay. And so what we're doing at this point is dealing with quite a bit of blown out values, because all we're looking to do here is accentuate, some of these darker areas of shadow and maybe wanting to push those a bit deeper. There we go. I know that we can't use that. Now it's stuck. There we go. It's stuck now. So as we're starting to do this, if your model has details like what we might see on the rocks here, say you're working on a hard surface model and you have little screw ports and different things, this is going to be really good to add a lot of detail to the lips of certain surfaces. But in this case, we can make this bright and manually adjust this the hard way. One tool that I like to use are these eyedroppers here. And so we can take, say, the black eyedropper on the left, and we can select one of the darker values and say, hey, we want that to be black. We want that to be as dark as it can get. That means that when we set that to multiply, that's going to be like a black spot or the darkest area. And we can do the same thing with the white. And it's kind of like automatically adjusting the contrast of things for us overall. So now, say we don't want this area on the chest to be shadowed. We can select that, and this is going to start pushing things a bit more towards those white points. Everything else that's above that is going to straight white and is going to be blown out. So with clicking OK, now we can head back down to multiply, and we can see here how the more shadowed areas are going to be getting quite a bit darker. And there we have it. Now we can use this down towards the bottom of our kind of relighting layers, because this is a shadow layer. And then we can start to work with the opacity, and we can drop this down quite a bit. And this is one of these areas where we may not actually want to have this going all the way towards the background, right? If we have a sky back there, we're going to be getting a darker sky, and we might want to adjust that. And we can easily do that just by selecting our Z depth. We'll create a layer mask with our Z depth. And of course, if we make it visible, this is going to be only affecting the background. We can invert that with Control or Command I. And now use levels, and we can start to pull that back from the background. There we go. And now this adjustment is only going to be affecting our subject and some of these areas as it starts to get pushed back, but the sky area is going to be as it was. All right, do we have any questions so far? I saw quite a bit going on in chat here. I'm not sure if I missed anything.
No, nothing. There was a question about ACs, but with Premiere and After Effects, so I was answering in the background.
Okay.
You can go on.
Okay, awesome. So we have those set up. Let's see. We just discussed the AO. We can actually bring that in. I like some of the details that it has there towards the face. Specular lighting. We did save this render pass. Now, with the specular lighting, if we head into a linear dodge, we're going to get some bright, more blown out parts. And then if we use screen, that's going to somewhat clamp it so it doesn't get so blown out. So 32-bit mode, we're going to be using the linear dodge or add blend mode. When I'm working in 16-bit, generally I'd like to stick with screen so it's not getting too blown out. And then again, with this being a smart object, we can use something like curves and start to tone in or hone in on the level of detail that we actually want to have with this specific pass. So if we click OK, what we've done is now we're only adding like a crunched reflection. So this is just adding some nice details on the snout. We'll see it in some areas throughout the rest of our subject here. And then I'd like to back up and take a look at the rest of the scene and see if this is anything that I really need to adjust. So I think that this would work out fine for now. I really like the way that it's impacting the light there on the front foot. All right. And so we can leave that. Now, at this point, let's talk about the Z depth a little bit. So we'll be talking about, let's just do, let's see here. I want to make sure that we get through some of the general stuff. So let's start off with atmosphere, because that'll be a good and easy one to do. So with our Z depth pass that we have in our channels, controller command, click to select that. We can create a new group. And with this group, we're going to, let's just create a layer mask. There we go. And now we can rename it. And we'll call this Atmos. This will be our atmosphere group. So we'll start off with a solid color adjustment layer, and immediately we can see the effects that it has. Because we have the idea of having fire in this shot, I'm going to make our background a little bit more blue and find something that works. This can all be adjusted later. And then I can also take a curves adjustment layer, maybe pull that underneath. And we can use this curves adjustment layer to start to add a little bit more. Maybe it's not going to work so well. You can drop the opacity just a little bit on the background. And now with the curves, there we go. So this is going to allow us to add an extra lift to the values that we have. So there are times where I'll use the curves adjustment underneath, and times that I'll use it over, kind of over top, and give us a nice kind of accentuated fog. Like that allows us to further push the values that we have there from the solid color. But there are also times where I'll just use the solid color as is at 100%, and I'll start to adjust the layer mask. So with this layer mask here that we have on the group, with it being selected, I can use our levels, controller command L. And now going into this, I can start to crunch down the black values, which are more towards the foreground, which is pushing all of these atmospheric effects towards the background. So I can use this to crunch those values or pull those a bit further towards the foreground. And then I can also increase the range of midtones that we have in here as well. So it's a pretty good idea for me, at least, to try to keep as much separation from that foreground and background as possible. It's kind of one of the general rules that I'd like to bring from photography into 3D, is having some kind of separation. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that, which is, obviously lighting, having nice rim lights and having that differ from your background. You could have a depth of field that's going to clearly pull your subject towards the foreground. In this case, I feel like we can play with the values quite a bit and maybe have our background just a little bit brighter. And so we can do something like this and just start to push those values a little bit further, like so. So at this point, if we had a sky behind our raptor and behind the buildings, we're not going to be seeing it at all because this is currently at 100% opacity. if I want to see that sky, one of the cheats that I usually do is just change to 90% opacity. You'll see a little bit of the detail back there and it will be all good. You just don't usually want to have a straight, kind of flat background if you're going for something that's a little bit more realistic. Lionel, let me know if questions pop up or statements.
There is a,
I can see your
yeah,
response.
there is a whole discussion about ACs, but this is not the subject, so I was answering in the background.
I see it in the corner. It's just like a ticker right now. All right. So this is a way that we can add atmospheric effects and a really nice separation from subject to background using the Z depth. So another way that I like to use Z depth is for things like overlays, especially when I'm talking smoke. Um, it's really just going to be the same process. And so what you'll see is as I'm starting to do these, different pieces of the project over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be using a lot of these same ideas, and the way the workflows from one thing to another are very similar, maybe with slight nuance changes and so on, but it's all really going to be wrapped around using layer masks based off of the info channels and the information that we have to make local adjustments and selections and things of that nature. So let's go ahead and pull in some overlays. So the mini pack from CGHacks, if you haven't downloaded it, go ahead and download that. I think we can put a link down in the chat here, but this is going to give quite a bit of, like I said, kind of like a good base test for everything that we have here, which is 3D rendered effects. So we could talk about that for a slight moment. We can do VDBs and, say using Pyro in Cinema, right? We can create smoke, create fire, create things like that. And that's a really good process to learn and know how to manipulate. I like to use pre-rendered 3D assets because a lot of the work that I do, especially with my composite photography and on the cosplay side, I don't always have time to go in and just render everything in frame and simulate all of that. And so what we started doing at CGHacks is building kind of VFX inspired overlays that are going to give you nice results without having to spend all of the time setting it all up in 3D and starting to render it. So SMOG, one of my favorite packs for smoke. It's going to give us quite a few different options, but this very similar type of depth that we're used to in 3D, we can use in a rendered overlay. So it's all obviously rendered transparent, but we can set this all up in a way to start to build some really nice atmosphere, and smoke details around our Raptor. And I think what we'll do is look for something that is a bit more on the rim light side. So maybe this one here. Pull that into Photoshop a moment. There we go, Smoky Raptor. Now, when I'm working with overlays, especially things like smog like this that aren't emissive like fire and whatnot, you want to make sure that you're starting to match the lighting directions as close as possible. So in this case here, it looks like quite a bit of that light is coming up, from the top left of our image. And so I'm just going to transform and then flip horizontal. There we go, for our smoke overlay in the background. And we can place this here and we will create a group. Well, we'll bring that back to the foreground. There we go. We'll create a group with this inside and call this smoke. And this is where we can start to talk about how we're going to use the Z-depth pass for this to control the opacity. So the way that I like to work in really my composite photography and the 3D side, especially once I get to post, is focus on a foreground, a midground, and a background. The midground is almost always going to be my subject, and the foreground and background are quite obvious, but I will use those effects to push towards the back for one whole set of smoke and then build an entirely different set of smoke towards the foreground and manipulate those independently. So for this one, we're going to push this towards the background. So we can grab our Z depth controller command and click on our channel icon here for the Z depth, and we will make a layer mask for our smoke here. So what this is doing is placing this all the way behind our buildings. So we do know that we have to make adjustments to this layer mask, and I'm going to cut these buildings out because I want this to be more directly behind the Raptor. So we'll use levels. We can use our white point here, our little eyedropper, and let's select one of these gray tones here. And so now with selecting the gray tone on the building directly behind our Raptor, that's going to push everything forward. Now we also have increased the value of our Raptor. So if we click OK and back on our group here, let's see if we can see it. They're pretty dark, so I don't know how much that actually show in. You can see very little bits of that smoke overlay right on top of our Raptor. But what we can do here is use levels again. We'll grab the black eyedropper and then click on our Raptor, and we can see now that we have a pretty solid mask. These grayscale values, when you're looking at a crunched depth mask, don't worry about those until they become a problem. So what I can do in this case, if I wanted to get rid of that, is take the extra step of, say, selecting my Raptor mask, selecting my layer mask, and then with black as my background color, I could press delete. Now we view that and we have a completely clean mask. So the way that I like to think about this quite often, and I actually do this in production, more freelance than when I was in studio, but if it looks right, it is right. And don't get so carried away with all of those small like masking details unless they become a problem. Just take that advice if you could take that advice and don't focus on stuff that doesn't need to be fixed if it doesn't have to be. I spent way too many years killing myself over tedious tasks and processes that just didn't need to be met. So taking a look at the SMOG or the smoke layer that we have here, we have this now inside of a group, and I want to talk a little bit about group blend modes because they allow you to do some pretty cool stuff. So one of my favorite things about using 3D rendered overlays like SMOG is that we actually use them on normal mode before we jump to screen mode like you would with a lot of photo overlays. So what this allows us to do now is head into a normal blend mode for our smoke. And then what we can do at this point is add something in here. We'll just do a curves. And we can make an adjustment to this curves. And we can see that now the curves is only affecting our smoke layer. And so as I'm starting to build the background and the foreground that we were talking about, it's all about being able to manipulate everything together. The old way of doing it that I used to do was just drag smart filters from one layer to another, or group everything and then have a smart object of that entire background smoke, then have to make adjustments. It's pretty easy just to work in groups like this, where we can just set it to normal and then we can make our different colored adjustments. Now, as far as the background's concerned and building upon all of this, as we start to get into the color differences of things, this is where we have to decide kind of like whether we're going to match our effects as we're building them to the initial plate, or we're going to match the initial plate to the effects. Generally speaking, if you're already rendering an entire CGI shot, you're going to know that, hey, that shot's pretty much how I want it to be. Everything else that we put into this is going to match that. So what we can do, I'm just going to create a new curves adjustment layer here instead of resetting that one. So what we can do at this point is use the values of our Raptor to control a bit of our smoke that we have in the background. In most cases, you're going to be looking at hopefully what is more of a neutral point, because our Raptor has quite a bit of information on them. So in most shots, if you have grayscale objects, say like a white vehicle or a gray vehicle, silver, you can start to pull some of the environmental colors from that for your different overlays, and that helps. But a cool trick here is having your curves selected, not the layer mask for the curves, but having the curves selected. We can alter option, click on auto, and we'll already see that there are adjustments that were being made. It's just enhancing the brightness and contrast. What we want is fine, dark, and light colors. And this is going to allow us to select our shadows, our midtones, and our highlights. For me, it's generally working the shadows and the highlights, and I leave midtones alone. So what we'll do is we'll select one of the darker points. Get in here, select one of the darker points of our Raptor. We'll use that as a shadow value, and then maybe the highlights, and we can select one of the brighter colors here for the highlights. Let's see if we can find one. We just know that that's going to be the light point that we have, and we can click OK. Now, saving the new target colors as default, I generally click no, because I don't want this to pop up default every time. There have been times where I've been working on a client project that I know it's every day, it's going to be that project for a couple weeks, and I'll save the target colors because I know exactly, that has to be added to the pipeline. But most cases, you're choosing no. And now we have our much better color matched variation to the smoke. And then we can use the RGB curves now here to still make adjustments to that, while all of that information is actually staying intact as far as the color detail. So definitely a good route to use. Let's talk about, let's see here. What do we have on the list? We are 12 minutes over. That's not so bad. It was worse last time. Are there any questions yet, Lionel?
No, we are fine.
Okay, awesome. So let's talk about adding different levels to this. So we will head back to our overlays here, and we'll just start to pull some of them in to make the process a bit faster. So this here is why I like to use this grouping method for all of these. Yeah, it's not a Maxon training session if it's less than an hour. That is true, Ricky. Very true. And we like to push it. We definitely like to push it. So this is why I like to work with these groups. And, this has been a little bit more disorganized than what I would normally do, especially in a client project. Like, organize your stuff as you're starting to build it out, or at least make sense of it. Maybe not rename everything, but make sense of it, and then organize before you save your final file. It's definitely something that is good to do, but this organization of smoke on normal mode inside of this group with a layer mask that's pushing everything towards the background. Then we have our curves that's making the color adjustments to this. And then we have any of the overlays for smoke that we want in the background. So I can just easily start to make adjustments to this. And now, say this smoke is a lot brighter than I want it to be. I can use a curves on this specific overlay and start to bring this down and have that match up whatever type of look that I feel I want to have for these specifically. So once I'm done, I can name this BG Smoke, and we'll create a new group, call it Foreground Smoke. And I'm going to repeat very similar to the same process for the foreground as I did the background. And the cool part is, just like you could in Nuke, you can copy and paste different parts of your adjustments over to one another. I do like Nuke a lot more for this type of stuff. I will say that. But for instance, our curves adjustment layer, let's go ahead and bring this. There we go. We'll duplicate it and bring it up. So Control or Command and Alt or Option, hold those two, and you can bring that up to the foreground. We're going to set our blend mode to normal for the Foreground Smoke group. And then we can start to bring in other overlays for this. So generally speaking, for the foreground, I like things that are just going to be kind of wispy, adding little bits of detail here. There we go. All right. And so with the way that these overlays are working, and this is one thing that it took me a while to get used to when I was working on this, versus something like a VDB in Cinema before I rendered everything, right? Is we have to adjust the alpha channel of this smoke and add to it to be thicker. So there's actually no way to do that inside Photoshop channels and a very kind of intuitive, quick way. And so the way that I do it is I just duplicate, duplicate this overlay a couple times, and we can merge those all down, right click, and convert back to smart object. So pretty much all we were doing is just multiplying that alpha on top of itself to get a bit more of a dense smoke. And now at this point, because we can see some of those sharp lines, we can just create a layer mask. Wrong button there. There we go. We'll create a layer mask and then a black brush. And then we can paint away any of those crazy lines that we're starting to get. I would suggest using a smoke brush. I do have one that is here. So remind me at the end of the stream, and I'll just throw the smoke brush in there so you guys can use it if you feel like it. Quick way to brush in some atmosphere and different things. And I use it for layer masks when I'm compositing smoke.
And this is where Photoshop gets very interesting compared to Nuke or After Effects, because it's in Nuke or After Effects you can paint a layer mask like that, but it's much more difficult. Here it's very natural.
Yeah, it is very natural. So I used to use Nuke for doing still composites. When I was learning Nuke, I went all in. And so it was actually a bit painful because, when you're coming from something like Photoshop, you're like, hey, I know how I could do this very quickly, going through that process. And you're right, there is quite a bit of a difference between Nuke and Photoshop and what you can and can't do, at least as easily. So always use the tools that make the most sense for the project that you're working on, if you have access to those tools. So yeah, there's that. Good tip. All right, so our smoke, we're going to bring that underneath the curves layer because this is going to give us the same coloring that we have with the rest of it. Now, what I am going to do is drop the values on this smoke quite a bit. Make that a bit maybe spookier towards the foreground. When I'm working with foreground effects, most of the time I'm not actually going to use a depth mask for that because it's supposed to be up in the front and centered. Unless it starts to get really weird in certain areas, then I'll probably mask off those individual elements, or just use a layer mask to brush out the areas that I don't want. So we can head back and grab maybe one more overlay. We can use this one here. We'll start off with matching the color. We'll just bring that underneath our curves. And we can place this over on the left-hand side. And then use curves and we can drop the values of that. Maybe a little bit more with the midtones. And there we go. So making it a little bit more hazy, I'm just going to tone this down with the opacity. And yeah, that's a pretty easy way to start manipulating things with the Z depth. So we looked at how to add a bit more atmospheric perspective. Color grading is actually the same way. So we can briefly talk about that. As we're starting to look at LUTs and how I use LUTs quite often for my renders, we'll just use Photoshop standard LUTs and bring in a color lookup. So with our color lookup adjustment layer, this is going to be, we'll just select one of our looks here, and we can start to use our arrow keys to start running through the different looks that we have from the LUTs. So I actually really like this one here. Maybe that one. So I like a mix of the two. This one could be really cool for more of the background elements and affecting a lot of that. So on this one specifically, what we'll do is see if we can set it to soft light. And I'm going to use this soft light towards the foreground parts of this. And then I want to use it on normal mode because that actually gives us like a very nice kind of hazy look. And so using the Z depth for grading, you can use it with anything that you could use a layer mask with. So we're using this on color lookups right now, but you can use it with curves, color balance, and so on. And it's going to work pretty much the same way. So let's select our Z depth and we can right click, delete our layer mask on the color lookup, place that back in. And now we can adjust our white values to bring that in a bit more towards the foreground. There we go. And now we can see how these values are working. I don't have anything that's very dark in this layer mask, because what I want to do is duplicate, and then we can set this to soft light. And now I'm going to select our alpha channel for the Z depth again. We can right click, delete layer mask, and add it in again, but use Controller Command I to invert that. And so now we are darkening the parts of our foreground with our subject in it, and then kind of lifting while very generally darkening the background. And so this is going to give us quite a bit of control. We can see where it's going to be getting darker here. Now, again, if we want to make adjustments to where this sits, we're going to have to adjust our layer mask. So we'll use levels for this and maybe push this straight towards the foreground by making our background darker. There we go. And there it is. Now we have a pretty cool separation between our raptor and the background. We could definitely finesse this quite a bit. And as we start to build in other effects, we can get a whole lot more crazy with this. But everything is still using kind of the same core principles that we talked about last week, that you're seeing some more of this week. And that's pretty much making use of the info channels as the alpha channels or an alpha library in Photoshop, and being able to manipulate all of that. So your alpha channels are going to be used as layer masks 90% of the time. And that's how we're going to start being able to build quite a bit of this as we get to week 4. So week 4 is going to be rebuilding the beauty pass using all of our different layers. And so a lot of these things that we're doing now, we're going to be looking at on the back end of that. So my process for rebuilding beauty passes is, or I should say working in 32-bit in Photoshop period, is making sure that I make adjustments to any of the exposure that I have in 32-bit mode, and then switching into 16-bit quite early on in the process so that I can use all of these different tools that we've been looking at today and last week to be able to start really adding more depth and visual effects elements to it. So do we have any questions?
No.
Okay, awesome. So
I really like this LUT technique, mixing the LUT with the depth field. That's very clever.
Yeah, and there's a lot of ways that we can. So let's say, for instance, this one here initially, like if you see the thumbnails and all of that, like there's a lot of smoke and a lot of fire. We could definitely talk about that. I know that we still got 5 minutes before we lose where we were last week. It's so bad. And so, if we're getting into fire, so something like FireFX is going to have a lot of pre-rendered fire. And so it's just starting to mix fire and smoke elements. Um, you can definitely build the way that we have been with the Z depth, but fire being emissive is going to be a little bit different as we push it, further back into the background. So I guess it's just more understanding how that would work, which is using the fire and the emissive bits and materials kind of on top as a top layer to everything. So in this case, we'll just grab one of the random overlays here and pull this in and maybe get rid of our foreground grade. We can get rid of our foreground smoke for a minute. So when we're working with something emissive, this is actually one thing that I like to do quite a bit when I'm on the 3D side is I like to place kind of like proxy lights and kind of like light my subject for the effects that I'm placing in later. And so in this case, you'll see that the Raptor has, lighting here off on the side. We could use normals to paint in a little bit more lighting. Now, in this case here, what I would use is the Z-depth pass to start layering this maybe in front of the smoke, but behind the foreground smoke. So in front of the background and then behind the foreground. And the way that is just by using the same technique that we've already talked about, by crunching the values for the background in the foreground independently, and then leaving that as a kind of black, in between. And so it makes it quite easy. So before we hop off the stream today, I feel like I could work on this quite a bit. We'll be doing a little bit more with this next week and getting into Camera Raw, which if you haven't used Camera Raw before is an amazing tool to do a lot of the color grading, a lot of the clarity and depth pops and sharpening and all of that stuff, saving your own presets. It's a very good way to do that. We're going to be talking about that.
That's a photographer tool, actually, Camera Raw. That's interesting to use it for 3D. Many people don't think about it.
No, I treat my 3D renders to me are like raw photos. I don't like raw photos. They just look meh, they're kind of bland. I like to spice it up a little bit in post. Sometimes it's just a slight contrast adjustment. Just knowing how I am, it goes way deeper than that. So photos are like raw renders. Raw renders are like photos. I treat them the same way when I'm in post. And a lot of this is actually very much the same thing that I do when I'm working on photo composites that don't have any 3D in them. So I'm using this same technique by, let's see if I just grab a filter here. We can just do the beauty. We'll use the neural filters in Photoshop. We can kind of show this off a moment. And they have the depth blur. Then if we click into that, this is going to give us the ability to output a depth map that we can use as a channel, or you can just use this to create a depth of field. So in the upper right-hand corner, I can click on the eye of my Raptor. It's going to say, hey, I want that to be our focal point. We'll increase the blur strength here quite a bit to maybe see that a little bit better, but we can see that it's blurring everything on that layer. It's important to know it's on that layer, but blurring it as it goes to the background. What I'd like to use this on is output depth map only, and I'm not actually going to click that because if I click OK, then it's, you know what, let's do it. We're towards the end of the stream. We can gamble a little bit, right? There we go. So I just didn't want it to take too long. And so ultimately, let me put a solid color. We'll put a white background here.
That's pretty good, actually.
So that actually did it really well.
Yeah.
Don't let this be the time that you think it's going to be perfect like this all the time, because it's not. But it is very good for creating very similar to the same effects that we have in our comp already. And so inside of the downloads, we can actually kind of start to end the stream here. So inside of your downloads, you're going to have the Raptor comp final. I knew that I was going to talk a lot and we wouldn't be able to get through everything to get it to this point today. So what I did is I went through and just built this out. This was for the hero image, but I left everything in here so that you could all see how it was built, using all of the different layers that we use from the CGHacks assets is in here. Composite Nation has an awesome plugin called Oniric. We talked about this last week. Let me pull this in here a moment. But this is how I like to do the bloom and glare on the Photoshop side for my 3D renders, and really any of my stuff. This is kind of like the chef's kiss, I call it. It's like the final touch that I use for all of the bloom and glare on almost any of my artwork these days. It saves a lot of time. I don't have to paint it, but that's Oniric from Composite Nation. You guys can check it out. I have the layers in here just if you get confused as to why that's there. But yeah, everything's going to be here, and you'll be able to see how I built everything kind of layer by layer from this base point. So yeah, check it out, and that's it.
And right, yes, 1 hour and a half. Not bad.
Hey, you know what? I think we are like 30 seconds under my talking length from where we were last week. So I think we made it.
It's pretty cool. All right, that was very interesting. Thank you, Dustin. So next week, I'm very eager to see what you're going to do with the image. So yeah, we will see next week. Don't forget, everyone, that you can watch the show again on Maxon Training Team. I put some links at the beginning and at the end also, because someone was asking how to open EXR in Photoshop. We see that we saw that last week. So please feel free to check that. Okay, thank you, Dustin, and we will see you next week.
Sounds good. Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.